I suppose it was all due to lockdown, but I essentially have always been interested in Shakespeare. I went to drama school. I've studied for many, many years. But actually, when I was a child, I used to say that Titus Andronicus had nothing to do with Romeo and Juliet. I couldn't understand, you know, how expansive this author was, and did he come from a grammar school? Because that meant I had to go to a grammar school, because that's the sort of family I came from. And I said, I don't believe you can have this whole education. And I used to argue about it all the time. And he was so fortunate. And basically, during lockdown, I was listening to Alexander. I think I lived with Alexander in my head. Every day I would fall asleep to him, I'd wake up, I'd fall asleep. And to all of them, in fact, probably half the room. That's, even you, I think I've listened to you, I've listened to everybody here. I've listened to everybody here. And I felt like I was having a love story with each one of them. And then I thought, well, you know, they need somebody who lightens it up, because the problem is most people can't listen to what's... you know, the density of it. You know, they won't listen to it. They have 10 minutes and they're watching Instagram. And I thought I'll appeal to that person, because I'll make them think. And that's what I intend to do with this film, which actually Alexander asked me to do last week. I was quickly editing with my friend Hector, and who's sadly not here today because he's in Los Angeles. He's working. And so he whipped it together. If there are any faults with it, I would be delighted if you could all come and help me, because we've got to make it available for everybody, and not just the clever ones amongst us. We've got to all think about it, because it has so much to offer. Thank you.
Just briefly, your new obsession is the authorship of the plays and poems that commonly we now say are written by someone called William Shakespeare.
Yes. Theatre in the Elizabethan era was really used as propaganda for the masses. There wasn't Saatchi and Saatchi, and there wasn't any form of advertising. So basically they got together a whole band of merry men who are very, very brilliant writers to write plays. The work is extraordinary, and it still lives today. For me, it's important to hunt whether or not De Vere did the plays, because if I was writing the plays, I'd want to be remembered, because they're works of genius.
Highly political. They write not of things that happened hundreds of years, as they do for us, but recent events, fairly recent events. One of the plays is about the Queen's father, Queen Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII. Now, they were very controversial. So I think if I had been the 17th Earl of Oxford, someone who saw Queen Elizabeth I on a regular basis and had had friends like the Earl of Essex who were decapitated, I might be very careful about what I was writing and be quite happy to attribute it to someone else.
We're going down to Taunton for a day trip, which is about 3 hours away, to interview Alexander Ward, the foremost expert of Shakespeare in probably the whole world, of the codes. And basically, I am going to interview him to discuss why Shakespeare, the wool dealer, did not write those plays. And in fact, it was Edward de Vere.
So I think you've got to think of it like the great artists of the Renaissance, like Titian or Velázquez or that lot. And they tended to have a studio. And in that studio, you would have quite a lot of apprentices. Some of those apprentices went on to be great artists in themselves, but when they were young, they came into the studio of, say, Titian Titian, as the great artist, would decide what is the subject of the painting, what is the main symbolism, what is the main meaning, and the most difficult parts of it, the face he would paint, and maybe the apprentices would paint the bit of toga or some grass at the bottom, and as they got better they would paint more difficult parts of these often very vast canvases. So I think what we've got is exactly the same situation in playwriting in England. So you would have the master, who was Edward de Vere, and
Yes.
we know as a fact that he was surrounded by a lot of servants who were playwrights.
You have a completely different take on this, and you say he didn't work with any of these people at all.
No, I'm not saying he didn't work with these people, but let's just change our thought about Elizabethan England, which seems very far away. But at the time, it was people telling on each other, and it was a terrifying world. You know, absolutely you couldn't be yourself, and you had to actually pretend to be somebody else in order to write what you wanted to write. I'm extremely happy this morning because my wish came true. I'm here at the De Vere Society. But now we've got you here, James.
James de Vere Beauclerk.
Yes, so can you tell us a bit about the wonderful history that you've been born into?
Yes, well, I would say we're here today to talk about Edward de Vere and Shakespeare and his connection to the Cecils.
Tell me your secrets. I will not disclose them.
With what I most enjoy, contented least.
And trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries.
Sings hymns at heaven's gate.
But then I scorn to change my state with kings.
We have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety.
John Dee, who I'm sure everybody in this room knows exactly who he is, the sort of conjurer and magician, he writes in the preface to Euclid, he urges people to contemplate or think about the number of their own name and its connection to Trinity.
There are many people in this story that are fascinating in the finding of who really was Shakespeare. But one of them is Dr. John Dee, who actually was the doctor at the time, and he was an expert on numerology, astrology, cosmology and geometry, and basically he lived along the river here. Let's go back to Dr. Dee, because I love Dr. Dee. How much do you think he was involved in the court? He was good friends with Elizabeth I.
I don't know if you call it friends, but she greatly admired him.
We see a small plaque of this very, very wonderful man who was a polymath, a mathematician. Probably he felt that mathematics was the most important thing in the world.
So he was looking into the future, he was doing magical spells, he was talking to angels and possibly demons, although he always denied that. He was very much involved in the spiritual world, in the world of geometry, maths, navigation. So he was in some ways the wisest man around in Elizabethan England, and according to some people he was also the biggest fool, that he was duped by a sidekick of his who was looking into a crystal ball and telling him what angels were saying.
Well, right next to the site where John Dee lived and had his library, and he had the biggest library I think in the Western world. Point here.
Dee was taking notes on all these conversations he was having with angels. So he becomes a man of enormous intrigue, Dee, a very interesting character. That
they used to summon up spirits, and the local mob were very worried about this. And in fact, when he was away travelling in Europe, he travelled extensively. They actually burnt his library down. I mean, goodness knows what would have been in that.
Many, many people around the world are starting to look into very deeply and try and find more about him and what he really knew.
Shakespeare couldn't have written these plays, especially the Stratfordians hate this question, okay, the dates. The dates are really important. John Dee is early 1500. Elizabeth I was 1533. You can suddenly see there's a problem with the dates.
Why is there a problem?
Because Shakespeare was born
too
in
young.
1564, exactly. De Vere's dates, which are highly important, are 1550 to 1604. Why did he suddenly die at 54? Nobody knows why.
There was a mastery of having more than one meaning, 2 or 3 meanings. And that actually brings us back to the whole subject of who Shakespeare was, because a lot of the contemporary evidence about Shakespeare is in poetical form. And those days, Ben Jonson, people like that, who wrote 2 poems about Shakespeare, in those days you had multiple meanings. And all you have to do is look at those poems a bit carefully, and you can see that they all knew, everybody knew, that Shakespeare was a pseudonym and that Edward de Vere was the principal name behind the name Shakespeare.
Apparently, we haven't had any luck this morning. I'm so upset. The painting isn't there.
Okay, this is all the fault of Edward de Vere, that his grave is hidden and Shakespeare, the wool merchant, is here instead. We're in Poets' Corner, and I'm absolutely thrilled to see that actually he's pointing northeast to the grave of Edward de Vere, beautifully talked about by Alexander Wall.
So Dee says in a preface to a mathematical book, he says everyone should try and meditate on the number of their name and connect it to the Holy Trinity. Now that seems an odd instruction, doesn't it? But if you can work out what the number of your name is and connect it to the Trinity, then you are closer to God. It's such a key, actually, this, to the Shakespeare authorship question. Because when he chooses a pseudonym, he chooses to mirror 1740. And he chooses the name William Shakespeare, which is 4017. Now, how does that work? Well, V is the 20th letter in the Latin Roman alphabet. And D would have nothing to do with the English alphabet, by the way. Nothing to do. You had to go to Latin, Hebrew, or Greek. So using the Latin, V is the 20th. There is no such thing as a W in the Latin alphabet. And in fact, even in English, it used to be known as a double V, not a double U. V and U are the same letter in Latin. So a double V, so if V is 20, then a double V is 40, okay? So you've got two V's together. And I hope at some point, actually, you probably can't see it now, but right up there's a double V right in the middle.
Well,
and
yes, I can see it
yeah,
there.
And so you can see how the V's overlap.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that in itself creates three V's, which connects him to God, or to Jesus more specifically, because it's the via, veritas, and vita, the way, the truth, and the life. But having established that the double V is 40, then you have Ilium Shakespeare that follows that, and that's 17 letters, okay? So you've got the double V, which is 40, followed by 17 letters. You've got your 4017, which is the mirroring of 1740, which is how he gets his name. But it's more interesting even than that, because the Ilium is Troy, and Ilium is where Pallas, Athena, sometimes known as Minerva, who is the patron goddess of playwrights. It's where, by her will, she shook the spear that enabled Achilles to slay Hector. Ilium Shakespeare is a tribute to the patron goddess of playwrights, but the double V also represents Edward de Vere, because it has the numbers 6, 2, and 4 in it. Edward de Vere, which is also 426. Earl of Oxford. It's all embodied in that double V.
See, I'm getting dizzy already. We've only just started. You know, we all grew up reading Shakespeare, you know, right from the word go. And there was nothing ever inserted in our theory of the history of Shakespeare that ever disputed who he was. But why? I asked why. I have to say, when you sent me the links and things, and you know, all these various theories, within 15 seconds of listening to them, I have to say it was so dense, and they didn't really illustrate anything with any kind of flourish. It was very rote and dull.
They're amazing words.
They are.
And whoever wrote these words is a genius, as you will say.
Exactly, and I think...
But I don't think it's Shakespeare.
I still to this day think, you know, because there's all these theories that he couldn't, you know, how could he write about foreign lands because he never travelled and all this stuff.
Well, exactly.
But I also counter that argument with whoever wrote these plays had the imagination of a great genius, a great writer. No doubt the works are extraordinary, and I believe that they are from one body.
I need.
What do you need?
I don't know where to take the conversation further, really.
Okay, well, you go ahead, but we'll go back because we're not finished yet.
We're not finished.
I'm not finishing
God, we're
with
not
you.
finished yet.
I'm not finishing with you yet.
Oh my
So
God.
you can do your speech.
I thought
Get
I
it
was
off your...
going to be a quick insert.